Welcome to tonight's video. Before tonight's journey begins, let me know where you're listening from. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow and allow the day to drift quietly away. Tonight we travel to Paddington Station in the first week of September 1911, where the evening stopping train waits at the far platform, bound not for the great cities but for the small ones, for the market towns and hedgerowed valleys of Gloucestershire, where the Cotswold stone still holds the last warmth of a September afternoon long after the sun has gone. Among the passengers this evening is Edmund Colquhoun, a retired engineer of 61, once responsible for the great rotating lamps of 3 lighthouses on the Cornish coast, now travelling west with a single canvas case and a set of old survey drawings to inspect a canal that no longer carries anything but rainwater and reflection. He expects a quiet evening, a slow train, and the particular quality of solitude that belongs to a man who has spent his working life keeping other people safe from a distance. But somewhere past Oxford, in a carriage lit by a single oil lamp, he meets Iris Wren, a young collector of seeds and cuttings returning from a botanical expedition in the Welsh hills, her satchel heavy with paper packets and pressed leaves, her boots still carrying the mud of 3 counties. This is the story of Edmund Colquhoun and of one slow autumn evening on the branch line to Chalcombe, when a man who spent his life building things that endure discovers something that was never built at all, only tended and allowed to grow. So close your eyes, breathe gently, and let the train carry you west through orchard country, lamplight, and sleep. The evening had turned gold by the time Edmund Colquhoun reached Paddington, the particular deep gold of early September when the light seems to have grown heavier over the summer, richer, as though it has been steeping in warmth for months, and is only now, in these last weeks before autumn proper, willing to pour itself out. It was a Tuesday, and the crowds at the station had the loose, unhurried quality of a weekday evening, rather than the press of a Friday exodus. Porters moving at a walk rather than a trot, newspaper sellers calling out headlines that nobody seemed in any rush to hear. The great arched roof of Paddington rose above the platforms in 3 vast spans of iron and glass, and the last of the daylight came through it in long slanting bars, catching the steam from the waiting engines and turning it, for a moment, the colour of brass. Edmund made his way along platform 8 without hurry. He was a broad man, not tall but solidly built, with the kind of frame that comes from decades of climbing iron staircases and hauling oil cans and wrestling with the great brass mechanisms of lighthouse lamps in weather that did not care whether a man was tired. His hair was grey, thinning at the crown, and he wore a moustache trimmed close, and his hands, when he removed his gloves to check his ticket, showed the permanent faint staining of a man who had spent 30 years around lamp oil and metal polish, a staining that soap had long since given up trying to remove. His eyes were a pale, weathered blue, the colour of a sky that has seen a great deal of weather, and they had about them the steady, unblinking quality of a man accustomed to watching a light turn through the dark for hours at a stretch, waiting for the moment a ship's lamp answered his own. He wore a brown tweed suit, well made but well worn, chosen for its capacity to withstand dust rather than to impress, and over it a heavy wool overcoat the colour of strong tea. And on his head a plain flat cap rather than the more formal hat a man of his age might have been expected to wear, because Edmund Colquhoun had never much cared what was expected of him, only what was useful. In one hand he carried a canvas engineer's case, battered at the corners, containing a change of clothes, a shaving kit, and a roll of survey drawings tied with brown string. In the other hand, a walking stick of plain ash, unadorned, purely functional, the kind of stick a man carries not for appearance, but because 30 years of climbing lighthouse stairs leaves a certain permanent complaint in the knees that no amount of retirement can fully soothe. He had retired 8 months ago from Trinity House, where he had served for 34 years, the last 19 as chief engineer responsible for the maintenance and improvement of the lighthouse apparatus along the North Cornish coast, a stretch of water that ate ships the way a moor eats travellers, who lose the path. In that time he had rebuilt lamp mechanisms in gales that flattened men twice his size, had redesigned the rotating optics of 2 lighthouses to throw their warning further into the dark, and had, on one occasion that he did not speak of often, spent 11 hours alone on a rock a half-mile from shore, keeping a temporary light burning by hand through a storm, so that a stricken collier 3 miles out could find the harbour mouth. He did not think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a man who had understood early in his career that a light is only useful if someone tends it, and that tending was not a glamorous word, but it was, in Edmund's private accounting, the only word that mattered. The station around him carried on its business, indifferent to any of this. Somewhere ahead, an engine released a long sigh of steam that drifted up into the iron ribs of the roof and hung there, catching the last gold light before dissolving. A guard walked the length of the platform swinging a lantern though it was not yet needed, a habit rather than a necessity, and a family of 4 hurried past Edmund with the particular chaos of people who had misjudged their time. The father carrying 2 cases, the mother carrying a 3rd and a child, the 2 older children trailing behind, clutching a hamper between them, its contents rattling with every uneven step. Edmund found the branch line train at the far end of the platform, shorter and humbler than the great expresses that departed from the platforms nearer the concourse. A modest engine of the Great Western Railway's smaller class, painted the deep Brunswick green that Edmund had always privately thought the most honest colour a machine could wear, neither boastful nor apologetic. Behind it stretched only 4 carriages, 3rd class at the front, then 2 composite carriages of mixed 1st and 2nd, and at the rear a single 1st-class carriage of older stock, its varnished teak panelling dulled slightly by years of service, but still handsome in the low light. This was not a train that hurried. It was a train that stopped at every station between Oxford and the Welsh border, at halts so small they had no more than a single lamp and a name-board, and it would not reach Chalcombe until well past midnight. But Edmund had chosen it deliberately, because he had long ago concluded that the branch lines showed you a country the expresses only rumoured at. He climbed aboard the 1st-class carriage and found an empty compartment near the centre, its seats upholstered in a faded blue-grey moquette, its luggage racks strung with netting rather than the more modern slatted shelves, and a small oil lamp mounted in a brass bracket above the door. Unlit as yet, waiting for the dusk to make it necessary. He set his canvas case on the seat beside him, propped his stick in the corner, and settled himself by the window, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has spent his whole life on the move and has never quite lost the pleasure of a first sitting down. A whistle sounded somewhere up the platform, thin and businesslike, entirely without the drama of the express departures Edmund had witnessed at this same station 100 times over the years. The branch line train did not so much depart as begin, a small collective shudder running through the couplings, a soft grinding complaint from the wheels, and then the platform began, almost apologetically, to slide backward past the window. Edmund watched Paddington's great roof recede, the gold light narrowing to a last bright seam and then vanishing, and the train emerged into the open evening air of West London, where the terraces and factory yards and allotment gardens were already beginning to surrender their colour to the coming dusk. The rhythm of a branch line train was different from that of an express. Edmund had always thought, gentler, more conversational, the wheels finding a slower, rounder beat against the rail joints. Do-dunk, do-dunk, do-dunk. A sound with more air in it, more room to breathe. The carriage swayed with a soft, unhurried motion, and the light outside deepened by degrees from gold to amber to a deep smoky blue as the train left the city behind and entered the wide flat country of the Thames Valley. Fields of stubble where the harvest had already been taken, hedgerows heavy with the dark clustered fruit of late blackberries, and here and there a farmhouse window glowing yellow against the coming dark. Edmund took out his survey drawings, unrolled them across his knees, and studied them by the fading light through the window, though he knew them by now almost by heart. They were drawings of the Chalcombe and Avon Canal, a modest waterway some 4 miles long, built in the previous century to carry coal and stone between a quarry and the river, and abandoned some 30 years past when the railway had made it unnecessary. The trust that now held the old canal's remains had written to Edmund 3 weeks ago, having heard of his retirement and his reputation for careful, patient engineering, and had asked whether he would consider inspecting the old locks and culverts with a view to a survey of what might be preserved, should funds ever be found to restore the waterway as an ornamental amenity rather than a working channel. It was not lighthouse work. It was not, by any reasonable measure, important work. But Edmund had found himself, in the 8 months since his retirement, restless in a way that surprised him, a man who had spent his whole life needed by something, now finding the days shapeless without a lamp to tend, and the invitation, modest as it was, had arrived like a hand extended across a gap he had not admitted to feeling. He rolled the drawings again, retied the string, and set them beside him on the seat, and for a while simply watched the country go by, Oxfordshire unspooling itself in the last of the light, the spires of a distant church catching the final gleam of the sun before the whole landscape sank into the soft grey anonymity of dusk. At Oxford, the train stood for some minutes at a platform far quieter than the grand terminus platforms Edmund was used to, a single lamp burning at each end, a station master in a dark uniform pacing the length of the train with unhurried authority. Checking doors, exchanging a word with the guard. Edmund watched through the window as a handful of passengers boarded, students in dark gowns hurrying toward the third-class carriages, with the particular energy of young men who had somewhere better to be, a clergyman with a black bag who settled into the compartment 2 along from Edmund's own, and, at the very last moment. As the guard's whistle was already rising to his lips, a young woman half running along the platform, with a large canvas satchel over one shoulder and a battered leather case in her other hand, her hat slightly askew, her boots unmistakably thoroughly muddied. She reached the first-class carriage just as the guard called out his final warning, and rather than search further along the train for an empty compartment, she simply opened the nearest door, which happened to be Edmund's, and climbed in with the brisk, unapologetic efficiency of someone who had made a great many trains by a great many narrow margins and had long since stopped feeling embarrassed about it. "Forgive me," she said, settling herself into the seat opposite with a small exhale of relief as the train, with a soft lurch, began to move again. "I do apologise. I was quite certain I'd missed it, and there is no earlier train to Chalcombe until Thursday, and Thursday would have been entirely too late." "Not at all," Edmund said. "There is room enough." She was, he judged, somewhere in her middle 20s, with light brown hair escaping in loose strands from beneath a hat that had clearly been pinned in some haste, and a face that was tanned in a manner not fashionable among the ladies Edmund generally encountered, the tan of someone who spent her days out of doors rather than shielded beneath a parasol. Her coat was a practical dark green, its hem noticeably weathered, and beneath it he could see the edge of a canvas skirt, divided rather than the usual style, clearly cut for walking rather than for drawing rooms. Her satchel, which she set carefully on the seat beside her rather than in the luggage rack, bulged with the particular irregular shapes of a bag stuffed with paper packets, and a faint green smell drifted from it into the compartment, crushed leaves and damp earth and something sharper beneath, resin perhaps, or the bruised stems of cut flowers. "You've been collecting," Edmund said, nodding toward the satchel. "Not really a question." "Seeds, mostly," she said. "And some cuttings, though cuttings are always a gamble on a train journey this length, they do wilt so. I've been 3 weeks in the hills above Lambert, and before that a fortnight in the Malverns. I am, for my sins, a collector, currently in the employ of a nursery in Chalcombe that specialises in hardy border plants, the sort of thing that will survive an English winter without complaint. My employer believes, not without reason, that half the interesting plants in these islands are still growing wild in places nobody has thought to look properly, and so he sends me out to look." "Edmund Colquhoun," he said, inclining his head slightly. "Retired engineer. I kept lighthouses for the better part of my working life on the Cornish coast." "Iris wren," she said, and something in her expression brightened with evident interest. "Lighthouses, now that is a proper trade, keeping something burning against the dark. I should think it rather noble work." Less noble than it sounds, Edmund said. Mostly it is oil and brass and cold hands and very long nights in which nothing whatsoever happens. Which is, in fact, the entire point. A lighthouse that has something happen to it has usually failed at its purpose. Iris laughed, a bright, unguarded sound. That is rather how I feel about seeds, she said. The best ones are the ones nobody notices doing anything at all, for months, sometimes years. And then one spring morning there they are, entirely themselves, as though they had never been anything else. The train had by now left the last lamps of Oxford behind, and was running west through open country, the fields on either side losing their last colour to the deepening dusk, and somewhere beyond the window a low band of orange still lingered along the horizon where the sun had gone down, the only remaining evidence of the day. The guard came along the corridor lighting the oil lamps in each compartment, and when he reached theirs he reached up with a long brass taper and touched it to the wick above the door, and the compartment filled with a soft, warm, flickering light that made the window instantly darker by contrast, turning it from a view of the countryside into a faint mirror in which Edmund could see his own. Reflection and opposite, the outline of Iris Wren settling her satchel more securely and beginning, with evident care, to loosen the ribbons of her hat. Chalcombe is a fair way for you to travel from London for seed collecting, Edmund observed. I'd have thought a nursery so far west would send you out from somewhere closer to hand. It would be sensible, Iris agreed, but my employer, Missy, Fenwick, believes that a plant collector ought to know the whole range of a country's growing conditions, not merely the conditions nearest the nursery gate, and so I am sent rather further afield than strict economy would suggest. I don't mind it. I have seen a great deal of Wales this year that I should never otherwise have seen, and there is something in me that has always preferred the travelling to the arriving. She paused, considering, though I confess after 3 weeks in a boarding house with indifferent food and a bed that sloped rather alarmingly toward the window, I am not entirely sorry to be going home. Home is Chalcombe, then. Home is a cottage a mile outside it, with a garden I am permitted to use as I please, which was in fact the principal reason I took the position. Mr. Fenwick pays adequately but not generously. The garden is the real wage. She smiled, and there was something unguarded and entirely without artifice in the smile, the expression of a person who had made her peace, some years ago, with wanting a particular kind of life rather than the life that was generally expected of her, and had found in that peace a great deal of quiet good humour. And you, Mr. Colquhoun? What takes a retired lighthouse engineer to Chalcombe on the evening branch line, if not seeds? A canal, Edmund said. Or what remains of one? 4 miles of water that nobody has needed for 30 years, and a trust that would like to know whether it is worth saving. And is it? Worth saving, I mean. Edmund considered the question with the same unhurried care he had once given to a compass bearing. I don't yet know, he said. That is rather the purpose of the journey, to find out, but I have found, over a great many years of examining things that other people have given up on, that the question of whether something is worth saving is very rarely the same question as whether it still works. A thing can have stopped working and still be entirely worth saving, and a thing can work perfectly well and not be worth the trouble at all. He paused. I don't say that to sound wise. It is simply what 30 years of lamps and machinery has taught me, and I no longer know how to think about anything else in quite the same way. Iris studied him for a moment in the lamplight, her head tilted slightly, in the manner of someone examining an unfamiliar specimen with genuine rather than idle curiosity. That is not so very different from how I think about a seed, she said. You cannot tell from the outside whether it has anything left in it. You have to plant it and wait, and sometimes you wait a very long time for nothing at all, and sometimes you wait a very long time and are extraordinarily rewarded, and there is no way of knowing in advance which sort of waiting you have undertaken. I have learnt to rather love the not knowing. It took me some years. The train slowed, the rhythm of the wheels lengthening and softening, and through the window, now fully dark, a scatter of lights appeared, marking a small station Edmund did not catch the name of in the dimness. A request stop by the look of it. No more than a single platform lamp and a low wooden building. The train paused only a minute, no one boarding, no one descending, and then drew away again into the enveloping dark of the Oxfordshire countryside, the rhythm rebuilding itself, do-dunk, patient and unhurried, carrying them both further from the city and further, mile by mile, into the soft black heart of the evening. "Tell me about the lighthouses," Iris said after a time, drawing her feet up beneath her on the seat in a manner that was not quite proper, and that she did not seem to care was not quite proper. "Not the mechanism. I shan't understand the mechanism, and you'd be wasting your breath. Tell me what it was like to be the one who kept the light burning." Edmund was quiet for a moment, turning the question over as he had turned over 100 technical problems in his life, looking for the honest angle of approach rather than the easy one. "There is a particular kind of solitude in it," he said at last, "that I have never quite managed to explain to anyone who has not experienced something similar. You are alone, very often, for long stretches, in a small stone tower, with the sea doing whatever the sea intends to do that night, and your entire purpose, the whole of your working life, reduces itself to a single question, asked over and over. Is the light turning? Is the light turning, and is it bright enough, and is it visible? Everything else, every other concern a man might ordinarily have, empties out of you during a long watch, until there is nothing left but the lamp and the dark and the turning." "That sounds rather frightening," Iris said, though her tone suggested fascination rather than alarm. "It was, at first. I was 27 when I took my first posting, at a rock light off the north coast, no more than a stone tower rising out of open water. No other building for 3 miles in any direction, and I remember the first night watch I stood entirely alone. How the silence pressed in on me. How I found myself talking aloud simply to hear a human voice, my own, in all that dark. But it does not stay frightening. It becomes, instead, a kind of company. You learn the moods of the light the way you might learn the moods of a person you live with, when it burns clean and steady, when the wick wants trimming, when the glass has gathered salt and needs polishing before it can throw its beam its full distance. And there is a satisfaction in it, in tending something so faithfully, that I have never found anywhere else. A sense that your care is not wasted, even though no one sees it, even though the ships that pass safely in the night because of your light will never know your name, will never know you existed at all. You did the work, and the proof of the work is simply that nothing terrible happened. It is a strange kind of proof, absence rather than presence. The ships that did not wreck, the sailors who never knew how close they came. Iris had grown very still, listening, her chin resting on her drawn-up knees. "That is very like gardening," she said softly, though I had never thought to put it in those words before. Half of what a gardener does is entirely invisible in its effects. You clear a bed of weeds in March, so that in June there is simply nothing there to trouble the roses, and no one walking past in June has any idea what did not happen, what weed did not choke what stem, because you spent an aching afternoon on your knees in the cold clearing it away months before anyone thought to look. "Then we have found the same trade," Edmund said, "under different names." "I think we may have," Iris agreed, and there was warmth in it. The particular warmth of two people who have each spent years privately convinced that the true shape of their work was invisible to everyone around them, discovering all at once that they are not, after all, alone in that conviction. The guard passed along the corridor once more, this time with a small trolley bearing a modest selection of refreshments for first-class passengers, tea in a large tin pot wrapped in a cloth to keep it warm, a plate of plain biscuits, and, rather to Edmund's surprise on so humble a branch line, a small selection of sandwiches cut into neat triangles and wrapped in waxed paper. "Tea, sir, miss?" the guard asked, pausing at their compartment door. "Please," Edmund said. and Iris nodded her agreement, already reaching into her coat pocket for a coin, which the guard waved away with the mild insistence of a man for whom the transaction was already settled by the ticket she carried. He poured 2 cups with the practised economy of motion of a man who had done this 1,000 times on a swaying train, handed across the sandwiches, and continued on his way down the corridor, his trolley rattling gently over the rail joints, and Edmund and Iris were left with their tea steaming in the lamplight, and the dark country sliding past the window, unseen now, existing only as a felt presence beyond the glass, hedgerow and field and copse, and the occasional startled gleam of a farmhouse window. "Tell me about the seeds," Edmund said. "Properly, I mean. Not the collecting of them, but what it is you're actually after out there in the hills." Iris wrapped both hands around her teacup and considered the question with evident pleasure. The pleasure of someone being asked, at last, about the thing she loved best and rarely had occasion to explain to anyone who might actually wish to hear the answer at length. "There is a particular kind of foxglove," she said, "that grows only on the north-facing scree above about 1,100 feet in the Welsh hills, a smaller, hardier plant than the ones you'll find in a cottage garden, with flowers a deeper, almost bruised purple, and it has adapted itself, over I do not know how many generations, to conditions that would kill the garden variety outright: thin soil, brutal wind, 6 months of the year in which the ground barely thaws. Mr. Fenwick believes, and I confess I share the belief, that such a plant, properly bred and selected, might in time produce a strain hardy enough to survive in gardens far colder and harsher than anything we currently plant with confidence, gardens in the north of Scotland, gardens on exposed coasts, gardens that presently grow nothing at all beautiful, because everything beautiful that has been tried there has simply died. And so you collect the seed. And so I collect the seed very carefully from the healthiest specimens I can find, at exactly the right moment, neither too early, when the seed has not properly set, nor too late, when the pod has already scattered its contents to the wind and there is nothing left to gather. It is a narrow window, sometimes no more than a fortnight in a whole year, and if you miss it, you must wait an entire 12 months to try again. I have, on more than one occasion, sat on a Welsh hillside in weather that would make a sensible person weep, watching a single seed pod, waiting for the precise morning it would be ready, because I had travelled 140 miles and I was not prepared to have wasted the journey. "That is not so very different from a tide table," Edmund said, "though I doubt you'd thank me for the comparison. A rock light must be serviced at low water, and the window is sometimes no more than an hour, and if you miss it, the sea simply closes over the rock again, and you wait for the tide to turn." "I shall accept the comparison," Iris said, smiling, "on the condition that you accept that a seed pod is considerably less forgiving of a man's timing than the sea, which at least announces its intentions with some regularity. A foxglove pod gives no such courtesy. It simply opens, one morning, without consultation, and that is that." They talked on as the train carried them further west, through a series of small stations whose names Edmund only half caught in the darkness, Charlbury. And then, somewhere further on a halt so small, it seemed to consist of nothing but a single gas lamp and a length of wooden fencing. The guards' lanterns swinging along the platform in the enveloping dark, a milk churn or two set down and collected. A word exchanged between guard and station master that Edmund could not make out, but that carried, even through the glass, the particular unhurried cadence of men who had known each other for 20 years and had nothing urgent to say, and no urgency about saying it. Iris told him, as the miles passed, about the nursery at Chalcombe, a modest establishment run by Mr. Fenwick and his 2 sons, specialising, as she had said, in hardy border plants, but with a particular sideline, which she described with evident private delight, in what Fenwick called his orphans, plants that had failed to sell, or been damaged in transit, or simply grown too large or too strange, shaped for a conventional border, which Fenwick kept in a neglected corner of the nursery ground, and which Iris had, over her 2 years there, gradually adopted as an unofficial project, a garden of misfits that she tended in her own time, for no reason she could entirely explain, except that she had never been able to bear the sight of something living, going untended simply because it did not fit anyone's idea of what it ought to have been. "There is a rose out there," she said, "that has never once, in the 4 years Fenwick has had it, produced a flower anyone would call attractive, small, a rather sickly yellow, badly shaped, entirely without scent. He keeps meaning to dig it out. I keep finding reasons he oughtn't. I could not tell you, if you pressed me, precisely why. It simply seems to me that a thing which has gone on trying to flower for 4 years, however poorly, has earned the right to go on trying a 5th. Edmund found himself, listening to this, thinking of a lamp he had once serviced on a headland in North Cornwall, an old mechanism, long since superseded by better designs, that the Trinity House engineers of 30 years past had wanted to decommission entirely in favour of a newer light a half-mile along the coast, and how Edmund, then a junior engineer with no real authority in the matter, had argued, more forcefully than was perhaps wise for a man of his rank, that the old light still served a purpose, a subtler one, marking a particular set of rocks that the newer light's angle did not quite illuminate, and how he had won that argument in the end, not through engineering logic, but through simple stubbornness. A refusal to let a thing be discarded merely because it was old and imperfect and no longer fashionable. "I think," he said slowly, "that we may share more than a trade, Miss Wrain. I think we may share a particular kind of obstinacy." "I shall take that as a compliment," Iris said, as I am quite certain it was intended. Outside, the darkness had deepened further, and here and there through gaps in the hedgerow Edmund caught glimpses of the sky, clear tonight, scattered with early stars, though neither he nor Iris remarked on them, both being, in their different ways, people whose attention was fixed rather more firmly on the ground than the heavens, on root and rock rather than light years and constellations. And there was something companionable in that shared orientation too, an unspoken understanding that their conversation, however far it ranged, would always eventually return to something that could be touched, weighed, planted or built. Somewhere between Charlbury and the next halt, Iris, growing curious about the fate of her more delicate cuttings, excused herself briefly to visit the guard's van at the rear of the train, where Harker had kindly agreed to stow the larger and more awkward of her collecting boxes, cushioned in damp sacking against the jolting of the journey, and Edmund, having nothing better to occupy him, and being, by nature, a man who had never in his life passed up the chance to see how a piece of machinery or a well run. Operation conducted its business, asked whether he might accompany her. The guard's van, when they reached it, walking together through the swaying, dimly lit corridors of the 2 composite carriages between, proved a cramped businesslike space entirely different in character from the comfortable first-class compartment they had left, its walls lined with racks for parcels and mail sacks. A small stove glowing dull red in one corner, throwing off a heat that Harker, seated on a low bench beside it with a mug of tea and a much-thumbed newspaper, seemed to regard as one of the chief compensations of his trade. Iris's collecting boxes, a half-dozen shallow wooden trays wrapped in damp hessian, sat wedged securely between 2 mail sacks, and she checked each one in turn with the brisk, practised efficiency of someone who had learned, through hard experience, precisely how much jostling a cutting could survive before it gave up entirely. "You keep a tidy van, Harker," Edmund observed, looking about at the neatly stowed parcels, each one labelled and secured against the rougher stretches of track, with a competence that Edmund, as a man who had spent 30 years ensuring that nothing under his care was ever left to chance, found instantly and instinctively admirable. 31 years on this line, sir," Harker said, not looking up from his newspaper, though there was evident pride in the flatness of his tone, the particular pride of a man who considers boasting unnecessary when the facts speak for themselves. "A parcel goes astray on my watch about once in a decade, and the once it did, I've not forgiven myself for it yet, though it were a hat box and no great loss to anyone but the lady's pride." 31 years, Edmund repeated. "I have kept lighthouses the better part of that myself. It is a fine thing, I think, to give so much of one's life to a single steady purpose." Harker looked up at this, studying Edmund with new interest. Lighthouses, were it? My brother served under Trinity House a time out past Padstow. Hard life, he always said, though he never once complained of it in my hearing, not properly, not the way a man complains of a life he regrets. Complained of the weather plenty, never once of the work itself. That has been my experience of the trade also, Edmund said. The weather is fair game for complaint. The work rarely is, once a man has properly taken to it. They talked a while longer, Harker producing, from some recess beneath his bench, a battered tin of ginger biscuits which he offered around with the unhurried generosity of a man well used to sharing his small kingdom with passengers who wandered back to visit it, and Iris, having satisfied herself that her cuttings had survived the journey thus far in reasonable order, settled onto an upturned crate near the stove and asked Harker with evident genuine interest how a man came to guarding rather than driving or firing, and Harker, warming further to the conversation, told them both a long, meandering, thoroughly enjoyable story about his early years as a junior porter at Swindon and the winter of a hard frost some 15 years past when the points had frozen. Solid at every station between there and Cheltenham, and how he and 2 others had spent the better part of a night thawing them by hand with hot coals carried in a brazier along the open track. An operation that Edmund, listening, recognised at once as precisely the kind of unglamorous, essential, entirely unthanked labour that had characterised the whole of his own working life, and he found himself sitting on an upturned crate in a swaying guard's van at some unmarked hour past 10, more thoroughly content than he had been in a very long while, in company that asked nothing of him beyond simple attention, and offered, in return, nothing more nor less than the plain companionable warmth of people who understood a trade well kept. They returned to their own compartment some 20 minutes later, having thanked Harker for his hospitality and his biscuits, Iris carrying with her the particular loosened, easy contentment of someone whose chief anxiety of the evening, the fate of her cuttings, had been thoroughly resolved, and Edmund carrying something less easily named, a small warm certainty that the branch line, humble as it was, unglamorous as it was none the less entirely alive with the same quiet, faithful tending he had given his own working life to, in 100 small unseen corners he would never otherwise have thought to look for it. At Kingham the train stood rather longer than the previous halts, some 10 minutes, while a goods waggon was shunted onto a siding to make way for a delayed freight coming the other direction, and Edmund and Iris, finding themselves with time on their hands and both, by now, thoroughly warmed by tea and conversation, agreed without much discussion that they might stretch their legs along the platform rather than sit idle in the compartment. The night air outside was cool and smelled of coal smoke and cut grass, the particular smell of a country station in early September, and the platform itself was lit by no more than 2 gas lamps, one at either end, so that the middle stretch lay in a soft grey half-dark, the stars, now that they had stepped outside the compartment's lamplight. Considerably more visible overhead, scattered thick across a clear sky. "I do like a small station," Iris said, walking slowly beside him, her satchel left behind in the safety of the compartment, her hands tucked into the pockets of her green coat against the evening chill. "There is nothing hurried about them. Nobody expects anything of you on a platform like this, at this hour. You are simply between 2 places, and for these 10 minutes that is entirely permitted." "I have always thought," Edmund said, "that the space between 2 places is rather underrated. Everyone is so anxious to arrive that they forget the arriving is only half the journey, and very often the least interesting half. I have stood watches on lonely rocks that I would not exchange for any arrival I have ever made." They walked the length of the platform and back, past a stack of milk churns waiting to be loaded, past a porter dozing on a wooden bench with his cap tipped forward over his eyes, entirely undisturbed by their passing, and past the guard, who stood near the rear of the train consulting his pocket watch by the light of his lantern, with the particular patience of a man for whom 10 minutes' delay was no cause whatsoever for alarm. "May I ask you something that is perhaps not my business?" Iris said as they reached the end of the platform and turned back. "You may ask. I reserve the right not to answer. That seems entirely fair." She was quiet a moment, choosing her words. "You said you retired 8 months ago. And you have spoken a great deal about the lighthouses, and rather less about anything since. I only wondered whether the retiring itself has been easy, or whether, like a good many men I have known who spent their lives at one steady trade, you have found the stopping harder than the working ever was. Edmund did not answer immediately. He had not expected the question, though perhaps, he reflected, he ought to have, given how freely he had spoken already to a stranger, of things he rarely mentioned even to old colleagues. It has not been easy, he admitted at last. I had thought going in that 34 years of hard service had earned me a rest, and that the rest would feel like a reward. Instead, it has felt, more often than not, like a kind of unmooring. I wake in the mornings now with nothing that requires me, no lamp waiting on my attention, no watch to be kept, and I confess I have not yet learned what to do with a day that does not ask anything of me. And the canal, Iris said gently. Is that an answer, or merely a distraction from the question? I had rather hoped it might be the beginning of an answer, Edmund said, though I did not think of it in those terms until you asked. I think perhaps I have spent 8 months waiting for something to need tending again, and when the letter came about the canal, I said yes before I had properly considered whether 4 miles of abandoned water in Gloucestershire was any sensible use of a lighthouse engineer's skills. It almost certainly is not, but it asked something of me, and I found I had missed being asked. Iris nodded slowly, and there was nothing in her expression of pity, which Edmund found he was grateful for. Only a kind of quiet recognition, the look of someone who understood the shape of the feeling even if she had not lived through this particular version of it. I think, she said, that most of the plants I love best are the ones that were left untended for a good long while before anyone thought to see whether they still had anything in them. There is a walled garden not far from Chalcombe, quite abandoned, that I visit sometimes without strictly having permission to, and there are apple trees in it that have not been pruned in perhaps 20 years, grown wild and tangled and producing almost nothing, and yet every spring they still blossom, out of nothing but old habit and whatever is left in them of the will to try. I find that rather moving, that a thing can go on trying long after anyone has stopped expecting it to. Perhaps, Edmund said, that is what retirement is, for a certain kind of man, an old tree blossoming out of habit, waiting to discover whether anyone still wants the fruit. I should think the fruit is rather good, myself, Iris said with a smile that took the weight out of the moment without dismissing it, and Edmund found himself, for the first time in some months, laughing properly, an unguarded sound that surprised him with its readiness. The guard's whistle sounded, and they made their way back to the compartment as the delayed freight train rumbled past on the adjacent line, a long procession of dark wagons drawn by a labouring engine, its firebox glowing orange through the grate. And once it had passed, their own train drew away from Kingham with its familiar soft lurch, and the rhythm re-established itself, and the small station fell behind them into the dark. Settled once more in the warm lamplight of the compartment, Iris drew her satchel onto her lap and, after a moment's consideration, opened it and withdrew a small paper packet, carefully folded, and held it out to Edmund. "Foxglove seed," she said. "From the hillside I told you of. I always keep a little back from the main collection, to give away, though I could not tell you why, except that it seems wrong to gather so much beauty and keep the whole of it locked in a nursery ledger. Plant it somewhere it will get poor soil and a hard wind, and in 2 years, perhaps 3, you will have something that would not grow anywhere soft." Edmund took the packet carefully, turning it over in his weathered hands, and felt something in his chest loosen slightly, an unexpected warmth that he did not immediately have a name for. "I have never grown anything in my life," he said. 34 years, and I could not tell you the difference between a seed and a bulb if my position depended on it." "Then you have a great deal to look forward to," Iris said, "and I shall consider it a professional obligation to have converted at least one lighthouse engineer to gardening before this journey ends." "I make no promises," Edmund said, tucking the packet carefully into the breast pocket of his coat, "except that I shall not lose it. That much at least I can offer. I have never yet lost anything entrusted to my keeping." "I rather believe you," Iris said, and there was something in the quiet certainty of it that settled between them like the last low light of the lamp above the door, warm and unhurried and entirely without need of further comment. The train ran on through the dark, the country now rising gently into the first low swells of the Cotswold Hills, and Edmund felt the change in the engine's effort, a slight lengthening of the beat, the faintest increase in strain as the gradient asserted itself. Beyond the window there was little to see but the occasional pale gleam of limestone, where a cutting had exposed the bare rock of the hillside, catching what little light the sky still offered, and the black irregular shapes of trees standing sentinel along the field boundaries. "Tell me about the walled garden," Edmund said, after a comfortable silence had settled between them, the kind of silence that asks nothing and demands nothing, simply exists as company. The one you visit without permission. Iris's face took on a particular softness at the question, the expression of someone about to speak of something they loved and had perhaps not often had the chance to describe aloud. It belonged, once, to a manor house that burned down some 40 years ago, struck by lightning, so the story goes, though I have heard at least 3 other explanations in the village, each more dramatic than the last. The house was never rebuilt, the family having lost heart for the place entirely and removed themselves to Bath, but the walls of the kitchen garden survived the fire, being some distance from the house itself, and stand still. 8 feet of old red brick enclosing perhaps 2 acres, entirely given over now to whatever chooses to grow there. And a great deal chooses to grow there, I take it. A very great deal. That is rather the point of it, to my mind. There is a pear tree against the south wall that must be 100 years old if it is a day, trained flat against the brick in the old style, its branches like the ribs of some enormous stranded creature, and it still fruits modestly, a few dozen pears each September, small and hard and not especially sweet, but I gather them anyway, because it seems a discourtesy not to, after the tree has gone to the trouble. She paused, and there was a private amusement in her expression. I have made, over 2 autumns now, a truly dreadful quantity of pear preserve that nobody but myself has any wish to eat, and I go on making it regardless, because the alternative is to let the fruit rot on the ground, and that I cannot quite bring myself to permit. That sounds, Edmund said, very like tending a light that no ship any longer needs, and doing it anyway, because the alternative is to let the dark simply have the coast. I think it is exactly that, Iris said. I had not thought to put it in such terms, but I think you have described precisely what I do in that garden, 3 or 4 evenings a week, when I ought by rights to be at home mending my stockings or writing to my mother, who despairs of me rather thoroughly. I go instead and pull bindweed from around roses nobody remembers planting, and prune a hedge that serves no purpose except to look less like a wilderness than it did the week before, and I could not, if pressed, offer any better reason than that it seems to me that a garden, even an abandoned one, especially an abandoned one, deserves someone's attention. It has not stopped being a garden merely because the house it served has gone. It has only become a more private kind of garden, one that keeps its own company. Edmund thought of the rock light again, the old superseded lamp on the North Cornish headland that he had fought to preserve as a junior engineer, and how he had gone back to visit it years later, long after his argument had been won, and the light had gone on quietly doing its narrow, unglamorous work for another decade before age and expense finally caught up with it, and it was decommissioned after all, this time beyond any argument of his. He had stood at the base of that tower on his last visit, an older man by then, and had felt something he had not expected to feel for a piece of stone and glass and brass, something closer to grief than seemed reasonable for a machine. And he found himself telling Iris this now, the whole small, unremarkable story of it, the fight to save it, the years it had gone on shining its narrow, half-forgotten beam across a stretch of water that the newer light did not quite reach, and the eventual quiet decommissioning that no argument of his could prevent a second time. I went to see it, after, he said. The lamp itself had been removed by then, sold I believe to a collector, the mechanism was gone entirely, and the tower stood empty, just a stone shell with the wind going through it where the glass had been. And I stood there a long while, feeling rather foolish, an engineer of nearly 30 years' experience, feeling something very close to bereavement over an obsolete piece of ironwork. But I could not shake the sense that something had been asked of that light for 80 years, faithfully, without complaint, without any recognition beyond the fact that ships did not wreck on the rocks it watched. And that when it was finally allowed to stop, no one but myself seemed to think the stopping deserved any ceremony at all. "I think," Iris said quietly, "that is precisely why you are travelling to Chalcombe with a roll of drawings under a canal that nobody has needed in 30 years. I think you have gone looking for another light to keep, because you cannot quite bear to let a good tending go unwitnessed twice." Edmund looked at her for a long moment in the warm lamplight, and found he had no argument to offer against this, because it was, put so plainly, exactly true, truer than he had managed to put it to himself in 8 months of turning the question over on his own. "You are, I think, Miss Wren, considerably more perceptive than is entirely comfortable in a fellow traveller," he said at last, though there was no complaint in it, only a kind of rueful admiration. "I am told it is a fault," Iris said, entirely unrepentant. "I prefer to think of it as a professional habit. One learns, gathering seed, to look very closely at things, and to trust what the looking tells you, even when the thing itself has not said anything aloud." The train slowed for Addlestrop, a station so small and so quiet that Edmund at first thought they had merely eased off for a signal rather than a proper stop. But the wheels ground to a full halt beside a platform lit by a single lamp, and for a moment nothing at all happened. No one boarded, no one descended. The guard did not even trouble to walk the length of the platform. There was only the sigh of the engine somewhere up ahead, and, drifting in through the not quite closed window, the extraordinary sound of a blackbird singing somewhere in the hedgerow beyond the platform fence, undisturbed by the hour, undisturbed by the train's arrival, singing as though the whole soft late summer night existed for no other purpose than to carry its song outward into the dark. "Listen," Iris said softly, and they sat without speaking for the length of that unscheduled pause, the blackbird's song filling the still air, joined after a moment by another, further off and further off again by what might have been a third, a chain of small unseen singers strung out along the dark hedgerows on either side of the line. Answering each other across fields Edmund could not see and would never see, this being, he understood without needing to be told, a moment that existed only here, only now, only for as long as the train chose to sit idle at this small unremarkable platform before continuing on its way. Then, as unhurriedly as it had stopped, the train drew away again, the blackbird's song fading behind them into the general soft rush of the night, and neither Edmund nor Iris spoke for some minutes afterward, both of them, it seemed, unwilling to disturb with ordinary conversation whatever it was that small pause had left in the compartment. The lamp above the compartment door had burned low enough by now that Harker, passing along the corridor on some errand of his own, paused to trim the wick with the small brass key kept for the purpose, and the light strengthened briefly, then settled into a steadier, softer glow than before, warm enough to catch the faint dust of the compartment's aged upholstery and the worn brass fittings of the window frame, and to throw a small moving shadow across the survey drawings still resting beside Edmund on the seat, their string-tied roll rocking gently with the motion of the carriage, patient, waiting, as unhurried as everything else about this particular night seemed content to be. It was Iris who broke the silence eventually, though gently, as though continuing rather than beginning a thought. "I have stopped there before," she said, "on this same train, at this same hour, more times than I could easily count, and it is never once the same stop twice. Sometimes there is nothing but silence and the smell of the fields. Once, in the spring, there were nightingales, which I had never in my life heard before, and have not heard since, not there, not anywhere. I have come to think that a station like Addlestrop is not really a place at all, in the way Chalcombe is a place, or London is a place. It is more like a held breath, a little pocket of stillness that the railway simply happens to pass through, and that would go on being entirely itself whether any train ever stopped there again or not. I like that description a great deal, Edmund said, a held breath. I believe I have spent a good portion of my working life inside exactly such pockets, on watch through the small hours when the whole of the visible world seemed to have agreed, briefly, collectively, to hold entirely still. The land beyond the window continued its slow climb into deeper hill country, the cuttings growing more frequent. Pale limestone walls rising close beside the track before falling away again into open field, and here and there on a distant rise, the black shape of a farmhouse or a lone barn stood against a sky now thick with stars. The cloud that had lingered over Oxford long since blown clear, leaving the whole dome of the night open and glittering above the dark hills. The guard passed again along the corridor, collecting the tea things with a murmured word of thanks, and mentioned in the unhurried way of a man passing on information rather than delivering an announcement that they were running some 12 minutes behind the timetable owing to the delay at Kingham, but that the connection at Chalcombe, such as it was at this hour, being no more than the last carrier's cart waiting to take the Trust's mail on to the Abbey, would not be troubled by so small a margin. 12 minutes, Iris said once the guard had gone on his way, is nothing at all on a night like this. I should be glad of 12 minutes more if I am honest, and gladder still of 20. I confess I find I feel the same, Edmund said, and was faintly surprised at himself for saying it aloud, though Iris only smiled, unsurprised, as though she had known the answer before she asked the question, and had asked it chiefly to hear him admit it. They talked on, more quietly now, as the hour grew later, the conversation drifting without any particular direction, the way conversation does between two people who have stopped needing to prove anything to one another, and have settled instead into the simple pleasure of company. Iris told him of her mother in Shropshire, who could not for the life of her understand why a girl of good family should wish to spend her days grubbing in hedgerows for seed pods, when there were perfectly respectable positions to be had as a governess or a companion, and who wrote to her weekly with a mixture of affection and mild despair that Iris had long since learned to receive with good humour rather than argument. Edmund told her of his late wife Margaret, who had died some 11 years past, before ever he retired, and how she had been, in her own quiet way, the one steady shore he had always returned to between postings, a woman who had never once, in 22 years of marriage, complained of the long absences a lighthouse keeper's life required, though he suspected now, with the clearer sight that age and solitude sometimes grant, that she had minded a great deal more than she ever let him see, and had simply decided, with the same quiet stubbornness Iris possessed, that the minding was hers to carry, and not his to be burdened with. "I think," Iris said, when he had finished, "that we are neither of us, you and I, very good at admitting when we have been lonely. You with your absent wife's silence, and I with a mother I answer once a fortnight in letters that tell her everything except the truth of how often I sit alone in an abandoned garden, because the company of plants is, on the whole, easier to bear than the company of people who wish I were someone slightly different than I am." "Then we are again in the same trade," Edmund said, under different names. "So it would seem," Iris agreed, and reached across the small space between the seats to touch his sleeve, briefly, lightly, a gesture that asked nothing and claimed nothing, only acknowledged, in the way a hand sometimes says what words have already said less well, that the saying had been heard. At Moulton in Marsh the train paused longer than usual, some 15 minutes, to allow a following express to overtake on the through line, and Edmund and Iris, by now well accustomed to the rhythm of these unhurried delays, did not trouble to leave the compartment this time, content simply to sit in the warm lamplight while the platform outside filled briefly with the noise and bustle of the expresses passing, a great rush of light and steam and sound that swept through the station and was gone again within a minute, leaving the little branch-line platform quieter than before, as though the silence itself had been freshly rinsed. "I always find that rather startling," Iris said, watching the last of the express's tail lamps recede into the dark, "how loud the world can be, and then how very quiet the moment after. It seems unfair to the quiet, somehow, that it should always be defined by what came just before it. "I don't know that the quiet minds," Edmund said. "I have always thought silence rather the more patient of the two. It is always there, waiting, whether or not anything loud has just finished happening. It is we who notice it more by contrast. The silence itself does not change." Iris considered this with evident pleasure, tucking the thought away the way Edmund imagined she tucked away an interesting specimen, to be examined again later at her leisure. "You are, I think, Mr. Culcahoun, a rather better philosopher than you give yourself credit for." "I have had a great many long, empty watches in which to become one," Edmund said. "It is not a skill I would recommend acquiring by any faster method. It is rather expensive, in years." The branch-line train drew away from Morton at last, gathering its modest speed once more, and the country beyond the window grew wilder and more broken, the hills rising in earnest now, dark rounded shapes against a sky whose stars burned with the particular hard clarity that comes only once the last glow of any town has been left well behind. Iris, Edmund noticed, had begun to grow quieter, her replies coming a little more slowly, her eyes drifting more often to the window and lingering there, and he understood, without needing to remark on it, that the long day in the Welsh hills followed by the long evening on the train had at last begun to catch up with her. The particular fatigue of a body that had walked many miles and slept poorly, and was only now, in the safety and warmth of the compartment, permitting itself to feel the whole of its tiredness at once. "You should rest if you're able," he said gently. "I shall keep watch if it would ease your mind. It is, after all, rather my trade." Iris smiled, her eyes already half closing. "I believe I shall take you up on that, Mr. Culcahoun, though I warn you I am a poor sleeper on trains as a rule, all elbows and complaints, and you may regret the offer within the hour." "I have kept watch through storms that would make a train's jolting seem like a cradle's rocking," Edmund said. "I believe I shall manage." Iris settled herself into the corner of her seat, drawing her coat more closely about her, her satchel hugged against her chest with the unconscious protectiveness of someone who had learned, through long practice, never quite to let go of what she had gathered, even in sleep. Within a few minutes her breathing had lengthened and softened, and Edmund, watching her in the low lamplight, found himself thinking again of Margaret, of the many nights he had sat up in a lighthouse gallery while she slept 200 miles away in their small house near Falmouth, each of them keeping their own private watch over the other's absence, and he felt, for the first time in a long while, that the two kinds of watching, the keeping of a light and the keeping of a person's rest, were perhaps not so very different after all, both of them a way of saying, without needing the words, "I am here, and you are safe, and nothing will happen to you that I did not first stand guard against." He turned the lamp down a little, so that its light fell more softly across the compartment, and settled back into his own corner, the roll of survey drawings beside him. The little paper packet of foxglove seemed a small solid weight in his breast pocket, and watched the dark country slide past the window, mile after quiet mile, while Iris slept, and the train carried them both on through the deepening night toward Chelcombe. The hills grew steeper as the night wore on, the train's engine labouring more audibly on the gradients, its exhaust beat slowing to a deep, unhurried thud that Edmund found, after so many years of listening to machinery, entirely soothing rather than alarming, the sound of an engine working hard and working well, exactly as it ought. Through gaps in the hedgerows he caught occasional glimpses of the wider landscape, a valley opening away to the south, silvered faintly by starlight, a line of hills marching off toward a horizon he could not properly see, and once, unmistakably, the dark shape of a church tower standing alone on a rise, its outline sharp against the sky, a sentinel that had likely stood watch over that particular fold of land for 5 or 6 centuries, and would, Edmund reflected, likely go on standing watch for 5 or 6 more. Indifferent to the small branch-line train passing below it in the dark, indifferent to the 2 travellers within it, one sleeping, one keeping a watch that had, for once in 8 long months, an actual and particular purpose. At a small unnamed halt somewhere past Morton, the train paused only long enough to set down a single sack of mail, no passenger stirring. No lamp lit on the empty platform beyond the guard's own lantern, and Edmund watched through the window as the guard exchanged the sack with a solitary figure waiting in the dark, a postal official or perhaps simply a farmer deputized for the errand. The whole transaction taking no more than 20 seconds before the whistle sounded again and the train drew away. And Edmund found himself smiling faintly at the sheer modesty of it. The quiet, unglamorous, entirely necessary work of carrying a single sack of letters to a place that would otherwise have had to wait another day for its news, and thought that this too, in its own small way, was a kind of light being kept, a kind of tending that no one would ever think to thank anyone for. And that was, perhaps, exactly the point. Iris stirred once, murmuring something indistinct, her hand tightening briefly on the strap of her satchel, and then settled again into deeper sleep, and Edmund, watching her, found the last of his own restlessness. The low persistent hum of unease that had followed him through 8 months of unmoored retirement, finally beginning to quiet, not because anything had been resolved, not because the canal would necessarily prove worth saving, or the foxglove seed would necessarily take root in whatever poor corner of soil he found for it, but because he had discovered, somewhere in the last several hours, that the not knowing itself, the patient tending of a thing whose outcome could not be guaranteed, was not the burden he had feared it to be. It was, he thought, watching the dark hills roll past and the stars wheel with agonizing slowness overhead, simply the work. It had always simply been the work. He had only forgotten, in 8 months without a lamp to tend, that the tending itself had always been the whole of the reward. The night deepened further, and the train ran on through a country that grew ever more hushed, the small stations further apart now, each one no more than a brief pool of lamplight in an otherwise unbroken dark, and Edmund sat in his corner of the compartment, with a low-turned wick throwing its small, warm circle of light across the worn moquette, and he found his own thoughts, in the absence of conversation, drifting into the same slow, unhurried rhythm as the wheels beneath him. Do-dunk, do-dunk, a rhythm that asked nothing of him beyond simple attention, simple presence, the same quality of watchfulness he had given, for 34 years, to a turning lamp above a dark sea. He thought of the canal, and tried to picture it as it would appear in the morning light, 4 miles of still water threading through Gloucestershire fields. Its old stone locks perhaps still sound beneath their coat of ivy and moss, perhaps crumbled beyond any sensible repair, and found that he did not much mind, in this quiet hour, which of the two it would prove to be. He thought of the walled garden Iris had described, the flat-trained pear tree against its warm brick wall, the abandoned roses she tended without permission and without any expectation of thanks, and found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, hoping he might be shown it, before his business in Chalcombe was concluded, hoping there might be time, in whatever days his survey required, for a lighthouse engineer to learn something of what it meant to tend a thing that grew, rather than a thing that merely turned and shone. He thought too of Margaret, and found that the thinking, this time, carried none of the hollow ache it had so often carried in the 8 months since his retirement, when grief and idleness had seemed to feed each other in a way that busy, purposeful years of lighthouse service had never permitted. He thought, instead of the particular quality of her patience, the 22 years she had kept her own quiet watch over his long absences, and understood, with a clarity that felt like something settling gently into its proper place after a long time out of True, that he had spent 8 months mourning the loss of his work as though it were a second loss of her, when in truth the two griefs, though related, were not the same grief at all, and could perhaps be allowed to heal along their own separate and different timescales, each in its own season, the way a garden heals unevenly, some corners recovering swiftly and others taking years, and no dishonour in either pace. The train slowed for another small halt, and through the window Edmund saw, briefly, a level crossing gate lit by a single lamp, a cottage beside it with one window still glowing faintly. Someone awake at this late hour for reasons Edmund would never know, tending a sick child perhaps, or simply unable to sleep, and he found himself, in the manner of a man who has spent a lifetime imagining the unseen lives behind distant lights, wishing that unknown watcher well, wherever they were, whatever kept them from their rest. Iris slept on, her breathing slow and, even now, her earlier restlessness entirely settled, and once, when the train took a curve more sharply than usual and she swayed slightly in her sleep, Edmund reached across without quite thinking about it and steadied her satchel where it had begun to slip from her lap, tucking it more securely beside her, and she did not wake, only murmured something soft and wordless and settled more deeply into the corner of the seat, and Edmund found the small, unremarkable gesture of care settling something in his chest that 8 months of solitary mornings had left unsettled, a reminder, quiet and entirely without drama, that the keeping of a watch over another person's rest was perhaps the oldest and simplest form of the work he had given his whole life to, older than lighthouses, older than lamps, as old as the first person who ever sat up through a long night so that someone else might sleep more easily. The hills began by slow degrees to soften and open, the steep wooded slopes giving way to broader, gentler valleys, and Edmund understood, from the shape of the land alone, that they were drawing near to Chalcombe at last, the country here more cultivated, more settled, dry stone walls following the field boundaries in long pale lines just visible under the fading stars, and here and there the dark shape of an orchard, its trees heavy, Edmund imagined, with the last of the season's fruit, waiting for the same slow patient harvest that awaited the walled garden Iris had described, and the small yellow rose that had never once, in 4 years, produced a flower anyone thought worth admiring, and went on trying regardless. The sky in the east had begun, so gradually that Edmund could not have named the moment it started, to soften from black toward the deepest, most reluctant blue, the stars nearest the horizon losing their sharpness first, fading by slow degrees into the coming grey of dawn, and Edmund watched this transformation with the unhurried attention of a man who had watched 10,000 such transformations from the gallery of a lighthouse, who understood better than most that a sky does not change all at once, but negotiates its way from night to day in 100 small overlapping stages. None of them dramatic on their own, all of them, together, entirely miraculous. Edmund let his own eyes rest, from time to time, though he did not properly sleep, drifting instead into the particular half-state he had perfected over 3 decades of night watches, a state in which the body relaxes almost entirely, while some small, steady thread of attention remains awake behind the closed eyes. Alert to any change in the rhythm of the wheels, any shift in the quality of the dark beyond the window, the same watchfulness that had once told him, from a sound bed 2 floors below a lighthouse gallery, the precise moment a wind had freshened enough to require his attention before any other man in the building had stirred. In this half-state, thoughts arrived and dissolved with a gentleness that waking thought rarely permitted, images surfacing without urgency and sinking away again before they had fully formed. He thought of the rose Iris had described, the small sickly yellow flower that had tried unremarkably, for 4 years running, to be beautiful, and had failed each time, and would very likely try again next spring regardless, and he found the image settling into him with an unexpected tenderness. A sense that he had been shown, in the space of one evening, an entire private philosophy disguised as an offhand remark about a nursery's unwanted stock. He thought of the pear tree trained flat against warm brick, 100 years old, still fruiting though the house it had once served had burned to nothing 4 decades past, and he thought that perhaps a canal was not so very different, 4 miles of still water that had once served a quarry and a coal trade long since vanished, and yet here he was, travelling through the night to ask whether it still had, somewhere beneath its silt and its 30 years of neglect, some capacity left in it to serve a purpose no one had yet properly imagined. The train crossed a small stone bridge, the sound of the wheels changing briefly, a hollow echoing clatter that told Edmund, even with his eyes closed, that water ran somewhere beneath them, and he pictured it without needing to look, a modest stream perhaps, or the upper reaches of the very river the old canal had once fed into, running dark and unseen under the arch while the train passed over it, indifferent, continuous, going about the same quiet business it had gone about for longer than any railway or any canal had existed to notice it. He thought, too, unbidden, of the years immediately following Margaret's death, 11 years past now, when he had thrown himself into his work with an intensity that his younger colleagues had privately, and not unkindly, remarked upon, taking on postings other engineers avoided, volunteering for the longest and loneliest watches, as though the keeping of a light might somehow substitute for the keeping of a marriage, and how it had, in its way, though not in any manner he could have explained at the time, the two forms of tending blurring together in his exhausted grief until he could no longer clearly separate the lamp he watched over from the woman he had lost, both of them, in some private geometry of his own making. Simply things he had loved and kept faithful watch over, and could not, in the end, prevent from eventually going dark. But that had been 11 years ago, and he reflected now, in the soft rocking dark of a branch-line compartment somewhere in the hills above Chalcombe, a considerably different man than the one who had thrown himself so single-mindedly into those early years of grief-driven service. A man who had, somewhere in the intervening years, without quite noticing the change, come to love the work for its own sake as much as for whatever it had once helped him escape, and who found himself now, in retirement, mourning not Margaret freshly, but the simple absence of a lamp to tend, which was, he understood with the same clarity that had settled over him earlier in the evening, a considerably smaller and more manageable grief than the one he had feared he was still carrying. The little packet of foxglove seed pressed faintly against his chest with each breath, a small solid reminder that he had, in the space of one evening's conversation, already begun the work of finding something new to tend, however modest, however uncertain of its eventual flowering, and he thought that this, perhaps, was the whole of what any life amounted to in the end, a series of lamps taken up and eventually set down, a series of gardens planted and eventually left to whoever came after, each one mattering entirely while it was in one's keeping, and each one, eventually, passing into other hands, or into no hands at all, and that the mattering was not diminished by the eventual passing, any more than a light's usefulness was diminished by the ship that, having passed safely by it in the night, never once thought to look back. Somewhere in the small hours the train slowed for a signal that Edmund did not trouble to fully wake for, the soft grinding hesitation of wheels easing against rail, a pause of perhaps 2 minutes in the open dark between stations, no platform, no lamp, nothing visible beyond the window but the vague suggestion of hillside and hedgerow under a sky now beginning, almost imperceptibly, to surrender its deepest black, and in that pause, that small unscheduled held breath in the middle of the night, Edmund heard, faint and very far off, the call of an owl somewhere out in the dark fields, a low, patient, unhurried sound that seemed to Edmund, in his half-waking state, entirely of a piece with everything else the night had shown him, another small unwitnessed watch being kept, out there in the invisible countryside, by another creature whose whole purpose, for this one particular night, was simply to remain alert while the rest of the world slept. The signal cleared, and the train gathered itself and moved on, and Edmund, warmed by the low lamp and the steady rocking, and the quiet certainty that Iris slept safely across from him, and that the canal, whatever state he found it in, would still be there, waiting when the sun properly rose, allowed himself, at last, a genuine and unguarded rest, not quite sleep, but close enough to it that the last hour before Chalcombe passed for him, in a warm, wordless blur of motion and starlight, and the distant fading call of the owl, until the grey light strengthened at last beyond the window, and it was time, once more, to keep a different kind of watch. It was Fenton? No. Edmund corrected himself in the drowsy half-attention of the small hours. There was no Fenton on this train, only the guard, a stout, unhurried man named Harker, whom Edmund had exchanged a few words with earlier in the journey, who came along the corridor at last as the grey light strengthened beyond the window, and knocked softly at their compartment door. "Chalcombe in 20 minutes or so, sir," Harker said quietly, seeing Iris still asleep in her corner and lowering his voice accordingly. Thought you'd want the warning, seeing as you've a fair bundle of drawings there and might want a moment to gather yourself." "Thank you, Harker," Edmund said. "Much obliged." The guard withdrew, and Edmund sat a moment longer watching Iris sleep, reluctant, for reasons he did not entirely examine, to disturb what appeared to be the first properly restful sleep she had managed in some weeks of hard travelling, but understanding that Chalcombe was her destination as much as his, and that she would not thank him for allowing her to sleep through her own arrival. "Miss Wren," he said gently. "Iris, we are nearly there." She woke slowly, in the manner of someone surfacing from a genuinely deep sleep rather than a light doze, her eyes opening first to confusion, and then, finding Edmund's face across the compartment, softening into recognition and a faint, unself-conscious smile. "Have I slept the whole way?" she asked, sitting up and immediately checking, with the reflexive care of long habit, that her satchel remained secure beside her. "The better part of 3 hours by my reckoning," Edmund said. "You did warn me you were a poor sleeper on trains. I confess I did not observe a single complaint, nor a single elbow. Then I have exceeded my own expectations, which happens rarely enough that I ought to mark the occasion somehow." She stretched, wincing slightly at the stiffness of a night spent folded into a train seat, and looked out at the window, where the sky had brightened considerably while she slept, the deep blue of earlier dawn giving way now to the first pale gold along the eastern horizon, the hills around them emerging from silhouette into soft, muted colour, green and grey gold, and the pale honey colour of the Cotswold stone that gave the whole region its particular light. The train began, by degrees, to slow, the familiar lengthening of the wheel's rhythm signalling the approach of a station, and through the window the first scattered buildings of Chalcombe came into view, a scattering of stone cottages at first, their chimneys just beginning to send up the morning's first thin threads of smoke, and then, as the train drew further in, the low stone station building itself, a single platform, a small goods yard, and beyond it the grey slate roofs of the town proper climbing the gentle slope of a hill toward what Edmund took to be the tower of the parish church, catching, even at this early hour, the first warm gleam of a sun not yet risen, but clearly not far off. "Home," Iris said softly, watching it approach with an expression Edmund found entirely unguarded, something between relief and simple, uncomplicated affection. "It looks a fine sort of place to arrive," Edmund said. "It is, on a morning like this. I shan't say it's always so generous. In February it can look rather grim, all grey stone and grey sky and no colour anywhere to speak of. But in September, with a light coming up like this, I think it is very close to the loveliest place I know." The train drew alongside the platform with a long, gentle exhalation of steam and the soft grinding complaint of brakes, and came, at last, to a full and final stop, the journey's rhythm giving way to a stillness that felt, after so many hours of motion, faintly strange, the ordinary silence of a stationary carriage seeming. For a moment, unusually loud, Edmund gathered his canvas case and his roll of drawings, and reached up to help Iris with her own case, which she accepted with a brief word of thanks, and together they made their way to the compartment door and stepped down onto the platform, into air that carried the particular cool green mineral smell of a Cotswold morning, wood smoke and dew, and the faint mineral tang of the local stone, still holding, Edmund fancied, some last trace of the night's coolness before the sun climbed high enough to burn it away. A solitary figure waited near the small station building, an elderly man in a rough tweed coat, holding the reins of a patient cart-horse harnessed to a low, open cart, evidently the carrier come to collect whatever mail and modest freight the branch line train had brought. And beyond him, just visible past the station fence, the beginning of a lane leading away up the hill toward the town, empty at this hour but for a single early-rising farmer driving a small flock of sheep along the verge, their soft bleating carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Well," Iris said, turning to Edmund on the platform, her satchel over one shoulder, her case in hand. The first proper sunlight of the morning just beginning to catch the loose strands of hair that had escaped again from beneath her hat. "I find I am rather glad the train ran late at Kingham after all, and rather gladder still that I very nearly missed it at Oxford, since neither of those small misfortunes would I now wish undone for anything. Nor I, Edmund said, and found that he meant it entirely. That 8 months of restless unmooring had, somewhere in the course of one slow branch-line evening, quietly resolved itself into something closer to simple, ordinary anticipation of a canal he had not yet seen, of a garden he hoped he might yet be shown, of a small paper packet of foxglove seed sitting warm against his chest, waiting for a poor patch of soil and a hard wind, and 2 or 3 years of patient, unwitnessed tending before it would show him whether it had anything left in it at all. The trust have put me up at the Feathers, on the Market Square, he said. I imagine I shall be here the better part of a fortnight, surveying the locks. If a lighthouse engineer with no earthly experience of gardening might be permitted to see this walled garden of yours, and perhaps be shown where a poor patch of ground with a hard wind might be found for a foxglove that does not care for softness, I should count myself very much in your debt. Iris considered this with an expression of mock gravity that did not entirely conceal her pleasure at the request. I believe that could be arranged, she said. Though I warn you, Miss Colquhoun, that once you have seen the pear tree against the south wall, you will very likely find yourself persuaded to make a second visit, and then a third, and I have known stronger men than a retired lighthouse engineer to find themselves, within a season, entirely converted to gardening against every prior inclination of their nature. I shall consider myself warned, Edmund said, and shall attempt to guard against it, though I confess I do not rate my own defences terribly highly after this particular evening. Iris smiled, and there was in the smile the same warm, unhurried quality that had characterised the whole of their long night's conversation. No urgency in it, no need to press the moment toward any particular conclusion, only the quiet, settled pleasure of 2 people who had discovered, in the space of one branch-line journey through the dark, that they shared a trade under different names, and were, each of them, considerably less alone in the keeping of it than either had believed the evening before. The Feathers is a 5-minute walk from the nursery gate, she said. I generally take my tea at 4, when the light begins to soften. You would be very welcome once you have had a chance to see your canal and decide what, if anything, is worth saving. 4 o'clock, Edmund said. I shall look forward to it more than I can easily say. She turned then and made her way along the platform toward the lane that led up into the waking town, her satchel heavy against her shoulder, her boots still carrying the mud of 3 counties, and Edmund watched her go for a long moment before turning himself toward the carrier's cart, where the old man waited with the patient. Unhurried air of someone who had collected a great many passengers from a great many trains over a great many years, and asked, without any particular urgency, whether he might be persuaded to carry an engineer and his drawings the short distance to the Feathers, and beyond it, in the days that followed, to the quiet, overgrown 30-year silence of the Chalcombe and Avon Canal, where 4 miles of still water waited, patiently, unwitnessed, to discover whether anyone still thought it worth the tending,